Hey, welcome aboard to another English language video. This is the third in a series of three which is about language change concepts for English language A-level. So this is the third video. Well done if you've managed to get through videos 1 and 2. In this one we're going to go through slides, now what is it, concepts 33 to 48. This is getting you ready for the paper 2 exam and of course maybe your language investigation as well. Okay, so this is concepts 33 to 48. Let's climb aboard and let's learn our last chunk of AO2 concepts that's really going to get you well prepped for the exam. Now, language change concept 33 is about phonological change. We are going to put the fun into phonology. Look, accent and pronunciation, they have shifted radically over decades and centuries, and they continue to shift and vary significantly across population groups. So if you're looking for both synchronic variation and diachronic variation, phonology is the place to look. Why does phonology change over time? Well, sometimes it's to do with ease of articulation. Right, so people have this tendency to do ease of articulation because after all we are speaking very quickly. Linguists reckon that we speak at an average of 3 words per second. So ease of articulation, and within that you've got this concept of assimilation. So this is where sounds which are adjacent to each other emerge. So take a noun phrase like £10. If you say that casually, you don't actually say £10, you actually say £10. £10. So that's the process of assimilation, which comes from ease of articulation. A second example of ease of articulation is omission. It's just the missing out of phonemes. Take a noun like thistle. The reason why it's spelt with a T in the middle is because in the Middle English period, the T was pronounced. Okay? And look at this, the word neck in Old English, chaneka. It was a complete pain in the chaneka. Another phonological change of note was the GVS, the great vowel shift from 1400 to 1600. So this was a really good example of gradual, large-scale phonological change. I talked about it in an earlier video. It basically was about the position of vowels and the length of vowels. Middle English five becomes Modern English 5. Language change concept 34 is about 20th and 21st century phonological change. The phonological change just keeps giving. In the early 20th century we get the rise of RP. Received pronunciation. This becomes a kind of high status accent form. This is helped because the BBC was established in 1922 and the executors decided that RP was going to be the characteristic voice, not only of the nation, but across internationally across the world. And so this consolidated its prestige. So we've got the development of RP in the early 20th century. And then in the second half of this century, certainly in the UK, we get a movement away from the expectation of using RP because it becomes, in some quarters, kind of associated with privilege. And in its place, you get more regional varieties of phonology. For example, estuary English, with its glottal stops, like bottle, and its dark L's, like football. And that's spreading across certainly southern England in the 1980s and the 1990s. And the other thing that's happening is rising intonation. So this is sometimes called uptalk, and that became prominent towards the end of the 20th century. And where did it come from? Well, some commentators look for its roots in things like Australian soap operas and of course Californian phonological forms. Uptalk. And as we move into the 21st century, we've got other examples of phonological change. MLE, for example, which is very different from Cockney. And we've got vocal fry as well, that kind of croaky voice coming from the back of the mouth. So there's lots of change happening in terms of phonology. Language change 35 is about regularization. This is an important one. Language naturally undergoes regularization over time. What happens is that you get smoothed out all of those inconsistencies and anomalies. Here's an example. Take the word shoe. Well, the plural form of shoe in days gone by was shoein in Old English. Over time, that inflection has been changed to S, so the morphology of S pluralization has become more regularized, which is pretty important because if you've got millions and millions of speakers of English all across the world, then the more regularized the grammar system, then the easier it is for people to master it. Older past forms have increasingly been replaced. So take the past tense form of the material verb sneak, that will be snuck. But nowadays you're more likely to be hearing that regularized form of sneaked with the ed inflection on the end. And when you get new verbs that come into the language, they all tend to have regularized endings. So when you Google something, if I did it yesterday, I Googled. Okay, so many people would argue that this kind of regularization actually represents some kind of improvement of language over time, making it more suited to be used by millions and millions of people across the world. Spread of language change. This is number 36. Now, some linguists argue that actually language is just inherently mad. It's unpredictable, it's random. You can't predict how language is going to change. Charles Hockett is an advocate of this viewpoint. He basically argues that people make errors, the errors get passed down, and they become common forms. And he gives an example, the gaming community's use of the verb PWNED, if people do actually still use that as a form. Jean Aitchison completely disagrees with Charles Hockett. So Jean Aitchison argues that actually, when you look at language change, it's actually pretty systematic. Right, language changes in a fairly organised, kind of controlled way. And she has this beautiful S-curve diagram. It's not often in English we get the chance to talk about graphs, but there you are. It's an S-curve diagram. So what you get is the emergence of this new language form. And initially, it's only used within a small discourse community. It's very slow, the diffusion of it. And then it seems to take off. You get this sudden speedy development where it seems to rocket across a whole population. And then finally, the sort of rate of change really slows down and that language feature kind of stabilizes and standardizes. Think, for example, of the construction of interrogatives. So if you are asking a question in Shakespeare's time, odds are that you're probably using this form, thinkest thou. So you're usually not using do. As we climb into modern English, do, being used as primary auxiliary verb here for forming a question, that becomes the commonplace form. So that's Jean Aitchison's S-curve diagram, where you've got a feature that just emerges quite slowly from a small discourse community. Finally, it takes off, and then it stabilizes and becomes the standard form. I'm really excited about this because now we're going to travel the world. We're on concept 37 and it's all about your world English. Right, how many speakers of English are there in the world? Not an easy question to answer. Answer 2 billion. When I checked this morning and I went round and counted them all, I came up with 2 billion users. Now, English doesn't have the most native speakers in the world. You've got your Mandarin Chinese, an estimated 800 million. You've got your Spanish, an estimated 400 million. But English is the most widely spoken language globally out of all of those 6,000 languages of the world. Can you categorise English? You bet you can, because you've got L1 English. So this is the English that's used by native speakers. You've got L2 English. That's English as a second language. And then you've got EFL, I've noticed I put those down the wrong way around, English as a foreign language. So those are your 3 commonplace ways of categorising world Englishes. Linguists being linguists, they're always going to come up with more categories. And so other categories would include ELF, confusingly, English as a lingua franca. You've got your Pidgin English, which is nothing to do with a bird, and we've got Creole English as well. Spread of the British Empire. This is language change concept number 38. So migration and travel and exploration, these initially resulted in the spread of English internationally. So you think of the development of a language English in the USA. Early settlements in America, they began in the 17th century, early 17th century. And if you think of, say, Australia, you've got your European colonists moving there in the 1770s. You've got colonialism, of course, and the spread of the British Empire. So this took English to places like India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Far East. In the 20th century, you've got the collapse of the British Empire, but nevertheless, English has remained a key language in many of these countries, largely as a result, nothing to do with Britain, but to do with American power. So the place of English in the rise of communication technology, like for example its place on the internet, has really consolidated English's international status. Language change concept 39, bring on Braj. This is Braj Kachru. This is his 1992 model of World English. Let me tell you all about that. So Braj Kachru, he devised one of these earliest models of World English, and it consisted of 3 circles. Looks like an enormous donut with a red bit in the middle. Now your inner circle, that's the middle bit of the donut, that's called norm providing, and those are your L1 speakers of English. These are native speakers in places like the USA, Australia, Canada, Britain, Ireland, etc. Okay? They are norm providing because that's the form of English that is considered to be standard form across the world. But out of that, you've got the outer circle. Okay? These are L2 speakers of English. These have particular distinctive varieties which emerge. Let's say you're speaking English in India, you're going to be speaking Indian English. Or if you're in Nigeria, you're going to be speaking Nigerian English. These are norm developing. These are not people who are trying to speak British and American English but not very well. These are people who are developing their own varieties of English. Norm developing. And then you've got your outer, it's called the expanding circle, and this is where English is being used as a foreign language for practical purposes rather than for cultural integration. So let's say, you are learning English in Japan or Brazil. You are sort of norm dependent in that respect, in the sense that you are learning English from the inner circle kind of standard forms. Okay, so this is the 3 circles that Kachru devised. Now, of course, linguists have criticised Kachru's model over the years. Obviously, being 1992, it predates the internet, and so what you could argue is that the internet has changed everything in terms of language, because people are much more exposed to forms of English across the world now than they ever were pre-internet. And also it kind of fails to address some of the diversity within the circles, and it also fails to address kind of like the proficiency of usage within some of those circles. So for example, yes, Japan, you might well be saying, well, this is expanding circle English, but within Tokyo, you're going to have all sorts of different levels of speakers of English there, from the root beginners up to the very, very fluent users of English. But one of the biggest criticisms that's made of Kachru's model are for its kind of implicitly prescriptive labels, because if you're putting L1 speakers as L1, they are inner, and then the ones outside are outer. That is kind of implying a value judgment, which, as studiers of English language, we don't want to do. We want to be describing forms of language rather than prescribing standards. We're now going to move on to McArthur's model of World English. This one is really good. So Tom McArthur's wheel model, so it's a bit different from Kachru. What you've got in the middle is this kind of idealized central variety of written international English, so that if you were writing answers in an English baccalaureate qualification in Singapore, then you'd be expected to be using this idealized central variety. Outside of that, a bit like Kachru's, you've got an outer circle, and that's of regional standards, where he's lumping together, let's say, for example, Australian and New Zealand Standard English as one region, and Britain and Ireland and Scotland and Wales as another one. And then beyond that, you've got this outer circle of more localised varieties, where Aboriginal English, for example, would be a kind of variety of Australian English. So a bit different from Kachru's model. It has been criticised, of course, and this is important because, of course, this is the evaluation. And in order to get the highest marks on your A level, you need to show that you're evaluating. But the model's been criticised for placing both, well, L1, L2 and English as a foreign language forms in that middle circle. And of course for including very different language forms in the outer circle, like for example Pidgins and creoles, which linguists would argue are very different things. Let's hone in now on a particular L1 variety of English. So this is American English, developed, as I said before, from the early 17th century, when the first settlers borrowed Lexis from Native Americans to describe new concepts. So within weeks, you have settlers writing home back to the old world and using words like raccoon and squall. So it doesn't take very long for new American forms to develop. There are some notable differences, of course, between American and British English forms in terms of your words, your Lexis. You've got words like British English autumn and American English fall. There are differences in grammar. So British English got, American English gotten, and of course phonology. So you've got in American English the high status of that post-vocalic R phoneme. So take a word like car, the R phoneme, which is foregrounded at the end of the word. So as in other L1 countries, however, American English contains a heck of a lot of synchronic variation. There's a lot of diversity, and a lot of those result from kind of migration patterns. So you compare, for example, the New York accent with the southern drawl of Texan speakers, and, you know, there are huge differences. We mention again Noah Webster. So it was Noah Webster who produced dictionaries and grammar books in the early 19th century, and they went some way to sort of consolidating this idea of American English as being different to British English. And your go-to example of that could be that word colour, C-O-L-O-R. You have some present-day commentators who complain about the spread of American English, and they think, this American English form, it's destroying British English forms in the same way as grey squirrels have overpowered the more beautiful red squirrels, the indigenous forms. So we're back to our debates about sort of prescriptive and descriptive views on language. Language change concept 42. Now remember, there are 48 in total, so 42 is about Indian English, which is a really good example of an L2 variety. So this develops in the early 18th century as a result of British colonialism. And of course there are different opinions in India today about how much English to use. Some supporters of the widespread use of English argue that, you know, it's the key to global development. If you want to keep in tune with the world out there, then use English, get good at using English. Critics, on the other hand, sort of want to preserve the status of their national languages. So the choice of which language that you use and which is your official language and which has status is a highly political issue. Of course, there are notable features of Indian English which are different from British English in terms of Lexis. So yar is a friend, lakh is 100,000, Congress wala is a good example of a politician. That's a really good example, that, because it's a compound between a conventional English word and a Hindu word, walla. So you've got grammatical differences between Indian English and British English. So, for example, in Indian English, the progressive aspect inflection is used for mental verbs in a way that it isn't used in British English. In British English, you're more likely to say, I believe in God, whereas in Indian English, you're more likely to be saying, I am believing in God. So that's one grammatical difference. Another grammatical difference is about the use of the S plural inflections, where in English we have certain non-count nouns like accommodation or furniture, where you wouldn't generally put an S plural inflection on the end, but in Indian English that you do. And of course there are phonological differences between Indian English and British English. So you have the rolled, heavily rotacised R phonemes, and you have a V consonant being used in place of a W, so water, for example. Some linguists have actually noted that Indian English is having an increasingly large influence on the way English is being used worldwide. And the example that David Crystal gives in one of his videos is the McDonald's slogan, I'm loving it, where there it's using the progressive aspect of the verb in what to us now seems like a normal way, but 20, 25 years ago when people started doing it, struck people as being unusual. So that's a good example of the influence, the worldwide influence of an L2 variety of English. Lingua franca, language change concept 43. So what is lingua franca? So lingua franca or English, it's where English is used as a common language among people who basically have different linguistic backgrounds. Think, for example, about a Bulgarian fridge manufacturer who is having a meeting with a South Korean business person. They're going to be speaking as English lingua franca. And Jennifer Jenkins is the expert on this. She argues that actually English as a lingua franca is a bit different to English as a foreign language, because when you're doing English as a lingua franca, you're using language not to blend in and to become a native English speaker, but you're using English in a purely functional way as a communication tool. So it's a kind of transactional relationship that you've got with the language. So according to Jenkins, English as a lingua franca, you've got more linguistic accommodation going on, and you've certainly got code switching. So switching between kind of English and native languages is very common. She says English as a lingua franca forms depend on the specific communication context rather than being an all-purpose English. Here are some typical features which have been identified of English as a lingua franca. You've got the dropping of the third person present tense, S. So, for example, he live in Pakistan. You've got the omission of definite and indefinite articles, like, for example, she went to swimming pool, instead of she went to the swimming pool. You've got non-variant tag questions, like, they are in Lagos, no. And then you've got the verbs of high semantic generality, like do or make. We are making clean the car. Those are a few typical learnable features of English as a lingua franca. Schneider is concept 44, marvellously Germanic name. So in 2007, Schneider devised the dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes. And what he's arguing is that English in countries which was once ruled by colonial powers, they develop English through 5 different stages. And here are those stages. In your first stage, which is called foundation, you've got English is brought to this new territory, and it leads to a kind of emerging bilingualism. So if we think about Singapore in Far East Asia, this happens in the 19th century, where the British start using Singapore as a kind of trading post. So this is your stage 1. In the second stage, he calls this exonormative stabilisation. So what you get is a kind of elite bilingualism, where you get people who are wanting progress, education and culture. They're buying into the whole idea of learning, speaking English. So in this case, in Singapore, it's British English becomes this prestigious form that is associated with progress. Your third stage is called nativization. So this is where your bilingual speakers forge this new variety of English and basically ties with the original country of origin. They start to weaken and you get the development of these new varieties. So in Singapore, for example, you've got the use of the all-purpose particle la, which seems to have many different meanings. We then move into the fourth stage, which is called the endonormative stabilization form. And this is where your local variety is accepted in society and in a sense becomes part of the kind of standard language of the area. And in this area, often you get 3 different levels of English, and they're called acrolect, mesolect, and basolect. So your acrolect I'll go back to that. So your acrolect is the form of language that is closest to British Standard English. Mesolect contains some forms which are slang and seem very different from British Standard English, using some of the local variant forms. And basolect is quite a broad vernacular, which is quite different from British Standard English. And so if you were across in Singapore, you might struggle to understand what the speakers of this basolect are doing. So this is what's happened in the endonormative stabilization fourth stage. And then according to Schneider, in the final stage, you've got differentiation, where you've got all sorts of dialectical diversity that happens, that even in a small state like Singapore, you've got different forms which are emerging in different parts of the country, because of course people want to show their aspects of their identity through their language. Language change concept 45 is some examples of World English Lexis and grammar. Always useful to have some examples up your sleeve of World English. Of course, World English forms, they reflect the culture of their speakers, right? If you take somewhere like Southern Africa, which incorporates South Africa and places like Zimbabwe, that alone has over 30,000 different distinctive English lexical items. And David Crystal, in one of his videos, tells the story about being in a taxi in South Africa and the taxi driver using the word robot to mean traffic light. So there's an example of a very distinctive international form of that word. Here are some examples of World English Lexis. Peelhead in Jamaican English means bald-headed. Bushmeat in West African English means game for hunting and eating. And basket woman in Sri Lanka, off the east coast of India, means a coarse working class woman. So those are 3 good memorable examples of World English Lexis, and here are some memorable examples of World English grammar, which is significantly different from British Standard English. And notice here again that these are not people who are getting it wrong and trying to speak British English but failing, but these are people who are consistently using this form, so they're becoming regularized varieties of this form. So you've got the omission of S plural markers on plural nouns. For example, 12-year schooling instead of 12 years of schooling. You've got double nominalization. My mother, she live in Kampung. Okay, my mother and she. So you've got double nominalization going on there. And you've got non-variant determiners, so no distinction being made between much and many in terms of the determiners that you use. Language change concept 46 is about pidgins and creolization. So Pidgin English is an extremely basic form of language that's used by speakers who have very limited linguistic common ground. So for example, Pidgin speakers might use me as a first person subject and object pronoun. They might say something like me go town. Okay, so it's a very stripped down form of language. What happens when two speakers of Pidgin get together and have children? Well, their children, they don't speak Pidgin, their children speak Creole. So creolization, it's the process by which a fully complex language develops from a Pidgin foundation. One of the most famous Pidgins in the world for English is tok pisin, which I know sounds rude, and that's spoken in Papua New Guinea, north of Australia, in the South Pacific, tok pisin. So it's a good example of creolization, and in our lessons we looked at a piece of Nicaraguan Creole where there was a sentence, it was about a water filter, and there was an instruction that said wash your hand dem good, and that meant wash your hands well. So there's a good example of a single short sentence which is a creolized form, wash you hand dem God. And notice how instead of hands, instead of the S plural inflection, you've got them or dem being put as a suffix or an inflection onto the end of the noun to denote plurality. In the same way as in multicultural London English, mandem, I am told, is used as a plural inflection. We're now on to the penultimate language change concept. This is about attitudes to World English. How do we feel about English, being so popular across the world? Some people are very keen. They argue that actually the spread of English it's really good. It's a force for good. It creates a comprehensible and accessible global language, unlike some other languages which might have more complicated alphabet systems. It's using the Roman alphabet, and therefore it's straightforward. Others, however, react against, understandably, the use of English because it's consolidating this cultural hegemony of native English speakers in the Western world. You have an advantage if you are American or British, for example, because your native tongue has this status or prestige. So some people understandably react against that, and the linguist Robert Phillipson argues that actually English has a more sinister kind of influence on languages because it's a language killer, right? The spread of English actually disadvantages, the other 6,000 world languages and causes many of them to become extinct in the same way as that in Britain on our own shores. Cornish and Manx, which was the language of the Isle of Man, disappeared over time. So, would you regard English as a language killer? Our final language change concept is about the future of world English. What's going to happen in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time to world English? Some argue that English is likely to become more uniform, right? It's going to get more standardized globally as more and more countries adopt English as their official language. And if that's an English, it's likely to be American English. And they argue that American English is going to continue to dominate across the world. And it's just going to reflect that continued economic and political power of the US. And that's going to be consolidated through technological developments that we've got on the internet and social media. So much of the traffic, the internet traffic across the globe is done in English. Some argue that these conversationalized forms, which are, happening in English, they're going to dominate English global disappearance. So you get more informalization. You might, for example, from a graphological point of view, see the disappearance of some punctuation features like the beloved apostrophe of possession. And others are arguing that, the English might become globally more diverse, in the same way as Latin did, and developed into sort of Romance languages in the past, spawning into languages like Romanian and Italian and Spanish and French. So actually English might not become more standardized, it might go the other way. It might become more diverse. So you might get these separate varieties of English which emerge, and this might be through sort of rejecting the cultural imperialism of the Western world, of the US and Britain. Some linguists argue for a kind of halfway house. They argue that your global forms might become more standardized, but actually your regional forms might become more distinctive and diverse. So in that sense, every speaker of English will be a kind of bilingual speaker of English, where you learn to use a certain standardized international form of English in certain discourses, but use much more localized variety in other discourses. Who can tell the future? So that brings us to the very end of our little videos about language change. Hopefully they've been some use. Good luck with your language change studies for the A-level exam. Goodbye. Thank you.